about grief. Grief that doesn't end with a funeral, but grief that no one really talks about. So I was talking to someone who was telling me about her neighbour whose husband is the main carer for his wife who's got dementia. And he was showing her family photos, wedding photos from the past, and she didn't recognise that. And that image, that story sat with me because there's so many people carrying that right now. And it's a grief that nobody talks about. It's a grief with no funeral. And I want to say something before we do anything else today is that you are allowed to grieve for someone even though they're still alive. So I've got a bit of training to do with you today, and I hope you don't mind me sharing some of that. And if you love this sort of content, I'm Bev Jessup. I'm a creative coach, and I help Christian women to connect their faith with their creativity. And I have a membership called Creative Sanctuary. And if you want to know more details about it, you can scan the code here. Down, you'll see the link down there, and that will tell you more information. And you can go to all the links down below to find out more about me. Anyway, so I've got a lot of training to get through, so I'm going to share my screen with you. Bear with me as I am doing this all live. Okay, can you all see that? Hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to put it in this mode. Oh, look, we've got the creation, God's creation in the background. Right, okay, so let's get to it. So as I said, this week I was organising a fundraising event for the Stroke Association, and someone came up to me and told me this story about her neighbour and how he's looking after his wife who's got dementia, and he doesn't really have time to go out and do things for himself because it's a constant caring role. And as he was sharing pictures of family members or occasions or wedding pictures, his wife didn't seem to recognise the pictures in that. And that really struck me very deeply, and I thought that's really sad because she couldn't even recognise herself in the photo, let alone him and the wedding photo, and she don't remember any of it. And I thought that is the most profound grief that people can carry. It's not a grief that ends with a funeral. It's a grief that starts while the person you love is still right there in the room with you. You've lost them before you've lost them, put it that way. So today we're going to explore that together, and we'll look at what it is actually, why it's so hard, and what we can do with it, including, I hope, what it might mean to bring it to God. So this is where I want to start with naming it, because one of the hardest things about this kind of grief is that there's no language for it. I used to be a speech language therapist, and words, having labels is important. But society gives us rituals for death, like funerals and flowers and casseroles on the doorstep, time off work. But when you're grieving someone who is still alive, there is no ritual. No one knows what to say. And so often carers and family members are just left to carry this grief entirely alone and in silence. I call it the grief that has no funeral. And I wonder if that phrase landed somewhere for you just now. Because in my many years as a speech language therapist And in all the conversations I've had since, I've met so many people carrying exactly that. People who are both still in a relationship and already bereaved. Love has nowhere to land, and that is what it is, and it deserves to be named. So, a researcher called Dr. Pauline Boss first identified what she called ambiguous loss back in the 1970s. And I want to share her framework with you. Not because I want this to feel like a clinical exercise, but because understanding what is happening in our brains can actually be profoundly releasing. So, when we experience a clear loss, a death, a relationship ending, our brains are designed to process it. There is, beginning, middle, and end. The kind of end that our minds can eventually accept. But when a person is still physically present, our brains cannot find the grief loop. It can't settle it. It can't resolve. And that isn't weakness. That's not a lack of faith. That is just a neurological reality of ambiguous loss. The broken circle that on this slide, as you can see. And I find the image really moving. There's a gap that can't be closed. And the three things on the right: no closure event, an ongoing relationship, and the cognitive dissonance of grieving someone who is still there. Those three things together explain so much of what carers describe to me. And because I work with people who've had strokes, and I look at the carers, and they will say, "Oh, he's not the man he used to be," and or even the stroke survivors would say, "Well, I used to go for a walk every day, and I can't do that." That's grief in itself. You know, and they might say, "I feel guilty for grieving." They're still here, and I always say to them that guilt is the gap in the circle. So this diagram might look a bit kind of academic at the first glance, but I want to walk you through it because it genuinely helped me to understand why this grief feels so different. The top left quadrant here is where we're focused today. Physical presence, but low psychological presence. The body is there, but the connection and the recognition, the shared memory, those have all altered and they've gone. And this is what happens with dementia, with significant brain injury, with certain strokes. The person you knew is physically in the room, but access to them has changed. And I think the quadrant in the bottom right is also worth a pause. Here, missing persons. People who are psychologically still very present in our hearts, but physically gone. Both of these are ambiguous. Both of those are losses that our traditional tools cannot fully hold. And if you're sitting with someone in that top left hand quadrant now, I just want you to know what you're describing is recognized. It is real, and it is one of those most complex losses there is. So this is a slide I really want people to see because it explains so much of why carers often feel unsupported. When someone dies, the world mobilizes. You get the casseroles coming in. Now, we have a church, amazing church, that when something goes wrong, if you're giving birth to a baby, you get meals delivered to your door for 2 weeks or so. If you've experienced a loss, or you've had an accident or an operation, you get these meals. Okay, in. There's time off work, there's a funeral, there's social acknowledgement that something significant has happened. But with this ambiguous loss, none of that really happens, because to the outside world, nothing has happened yet. Your loved one is still alive, and so the grief is invisible. And that invisibility, that's its own wound, really. And there's a term here, disenfranchised grief. Sounds a bit posh, really, doesn't it? Which basically it means grief that isn't socially acknowledged or validated, and it's extraordinarily common among the carers. And the phrase I love here, both still married and already bereaved, both things are true, and that paradox is it's just exhausting to carry. So if you're ever felt like you've had no right to grieve because they're still here, this slide is for you. And you have every right. Your grief is real and it deserves to be held. So I want to look at the two diagrams side by side here, because this is something I find really illuminating about grief, about the anticipatory grief. Okay, with traditional losses, there's a peak, and then that's what the curve looks like. A moment of acute grief, and then slowly over time, the waves ease. But with anticipatory grief, can you see how there's ebbs and flows? Okay, it's cyclical, it's ongoing. It's never quite settling, because every new decline is another loss. Every time they forget something new, or they change in another way, like say they can't cut up their food anymore. They can't get, you have to feed them. Or they can't go to the toilet, so you have to get incontinence pads in or whatever. And it's just another wave of grief, another small funeral. And in my SLT work, my speech therapy work, I walked with people navigating neurological decline. And even parents, that they've given birth to a child, and they had all these hopes and dreams for that child. And, especially if it's the only child, can you imagine how you have to come to terms with that grief, that he's not going to be the doctor, lawyer, or whatever, happily married kind of person that you thought he was going to be. But what I noticed was that it wasn't the big moments that broke people, it was the accumulation, the daily installments of loss, getting up every morning and not quite knowing which version of that person you love you'll encounter that day. And that wears you down in ways that are very hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. And I want to acknowledge that here without rushing past it. This is hard. Grieving in installments is hard. And you're allowed to say that out loud. Tell people, especially if they don't really understand it, educate them. So I want to spend a little time on this slide because it shows us the weight that carers are carrying. Often, entirely unseen. At the center here is the caregiver, and radiating out are these four things that are happening, simultaneously. First of all, we've got the identity disruption. Who am I now in this relationship? I was the husband, I was the wife, and now I'm something else. I'm like a clinical carer, a decision maker. Do we put the stair lifts in, or do we have to get another carer in? And somewhere in that shift, I can lose myself. And then there's the role confusion. The partner becomes the medical manager, managing all the medication. The adult child becomes a parent. Those roles reversals are just disorientating, really, aren't they? And then you've got the disenfranchised grief, carrying enormous sorrow that the world doesn't see or name, and just feeling isolated. No one seems to understand what I'm going through. Yeah? And then there's the chronic stress, the psychological toll of long-term hypervigilance, of never quite being off duty, of always being alert to the next change, the next decline, the next need. It could be in the middle of the night. You're never 24/7, you're not off duty. And those four things together, that's what ambiguous loss actually feels like to live. Not just sad, it's exhausting, it's confusing, it's invisible, and it happens all at once. And if that's where you are, I see you, and God sees you too. So I want to briefly walk you through this table, because I know many of you will be living alongside one of those specific conditions, and the experience of each one is genuinely different. So Alzheimer's here, as you can see, Alzheimer's takes memory gradually, and for the carer, it often feels like the shared history is slowly being erased. The stories you built together, the in-jokes, the accumulated knowing of a long story, a long relationship. Lewy body dementia, which was the condition I mentioned from Wednesday's event. Always fluctuating awareness. Someone can seem quite present one moment and then slip away again. And that unpredictability has its own particular anguish. You learn not to trust the good moments because they might not be there tomorrow. Vascular dementia tends to decline in steps after a stroke or a series of small strokes, and that sudden shift can feel very shocking each time. And then frontal temporal dementia often changes personality first, before memory. And so the carer might say they become someone else entirely. The person is still physically recognizable, but the way they engage with the world is just fundamentally different. And with a stroke, something I sat with professionally for many years, the person may come home, but the language, the memory, the emotional regulation, where they just burst into tears for no apparent reason, can all be altered. And they came home, but they weren't the same person. And across all this, what is most devastating is the loss of mutual recognition, being unknown by someone who has known you most of your life. And that is a profound grief. So I want to offer a gentle reframe here, something that I've found genuinely helpful in conversations with carers. When we say they are disappearing, it places something catastrophic onto that person. And it also makes us feel like we are losing our grip on them entirely. But if we can gently shift the language to the way I knew them is changing, or my access to them is altering, something important happens. We are acknowledging that they are still here, Their dignity is intact. They are not disappearing. They are changed. And we are simply having to find new ways to reach them, new moments of connection, and in a different landscape than the one we expected. So this isn't denial. It's not pretending that the loss isn't real. Um, it's holding both things simultaneously. And actually, in my experience as a former speech language therapist, this small kind of linguistic shift can open up a space for people to find genuine moments of connection that they might otherwise have closed themselves off to. You know, let's face it, the grief is real. It's still real. But so are the moments that remain. So this is the heart of everything we've been exploring today. We don't survive this kind of loss by resolving it, by choosing one side, by deciding either I choose to only see what remains or I give myself over entirely to the grief. We survive it by expanding our capacity to hold both realities at the same time. You know, they are here and I'm losing them. Both are true. And the invitation, and it's a profound invitation, is to let both be true without having to fix it either. And I've seen people discover a kind of peace in that, that surprised them. Not a resolution, not end to the grief, but a wider container, a capacity to be present to what remains, whilst also to grieve what is changing. Um, and that is the art of holding both. And it is generally an art. It takes practice, it takes grace. And I believe with all my heart, it is something God can meet us in. So, what do we actually do with this? I want to offer you three things that the research shows that can genuinely help, and that I'd also say from a faith perspective, and I'm a Christian, that are like deep, meaningful practices. The first is naming the loss, simply speaking it out loud. I'm grieving my husband while he's still alive. I'm grieving the person my mother used to be. That act of naming it, not explaining it, not kind of justifying it, just naming it. And it kind of reduces that psychological distress. It bypasses the need to make grief make sense, because it doesn't make sense. It simply says, it is what it is. This is what it is. The second meaning making, and that doesn't mean finding a silver lining or a lesson. It means shifting the goal from closure, which ambiguous loss will never give us, to learning to live with open questions, allowing those contradictory emotions to coexist. The grief and the love for that person, the loss as well as the presence of that person, the sadness as well as the gratitude for that person. Both are true. They both coexist. And the third is rituals without closure, creating containers for ongoing feelings, a journal, a daily prayer, a symbolic act that says, today I'm honouring what I'm carrying. And this is exactly what we do. And that's what we're going to do on the 29th of May. I've left the link down below, but come to the free Grief Pages workshop. All you need to do is come to creativesoulspace.com/grief pages. And we will create and we will give grief somewhere to land on a page. We don't resolve it, we just hold it on a page. So I want to end this teaching part today here, because this is where, for me, everything comes together. Jesus wept is one of the shortest verses in the Bible, because Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Not after, not when everything was resolved, in the moment, in the middle of the grief, before the resurrection. Jesus entered fully into that present pain. He knew what was coming. He could see the whole picture, and still he wept. So presence over explanation, that is the posture of God towards this kind of grief. Not, let me explain why this is happening. Not, here is a theological framework that will make sense. But simply, I'm here in this with you. Let's weep together. And Psalm 34, verse 18, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. It's not the Lord will fix the brokenhearted, not the Lord has a plan for the brokenhearted, just he's close, the proximity, the presence. He's there, present with you. And lament, complaining to God, just telling him how you feel, that is real form of prayer. That is a valid prayer. And you don't have to have it all together to pray. You don't have to have it resolved. You can't, in this situation, you can't resolve the grief, and you don't need to find the meaning. You can just come to God with that open circle and say, I don't have an ending to this, and he can hold that with you. Okay, so that is the spiritual posture of proximity, and it's enough. So I'm just going to finish in prayer. Lord, we bring grief that has no funeral. We bring to you all those people who are grieving someone who's still present. The loss that that nobody sees. The love that has nowhere to land on today. We bring the carers, the partners, the ones who keep showing up 24/7. I mean, just pray you hold them, see them, let them know they are not forgotten by you, even when it feels like the person they love has forgotten them. In Jesus' name, amen. So I want to leave you. You're allowed to grieve through someone who is still breathing. If you're carrying this kind of loss right now, that is a permission I want you to take away today. The grief is real. The love is real. You are simply learning the profound art of holding both together. And I wanted to give you some prompts that maybe you might want to do some journaling today. Write the name of the person you're grieving while they're still here. And then write one sentence. I miss the version of who, ... I miss the version of who, and think about of who they were like. Prompt 2. What is still true about them even now? What flicker of the person you love do you still sometimes see? Write that down in your journal. And then prompt 3 is a letter. Write 3 lines to God about the grief. Not a prayer you have to perform, just honest words. Just be completely honest with him. Even if you're holding that anger and that frustration, he knows. Be honest with him. So if today has stirred something in you, I want to invite you to join me to the grief pages. It's a free live workshop on Friday the 29th of May at 3 p.m. UK time. I've left the link down below. People are coming from all over the world. I'm really excited. And if you can show up on the day, you receive the free companion workbook that goes with it. And yeah, I'm just really excited for that. So I can't wait to see you at creativesoulspace.com/grief pages. And if you want to join the Creative Sanctuary, all the resources from that workshop will go into the membership, and you can try out Creative Sanctuary. Just scan the QR code here, and you can try it out for $1 for 7 days, and thereafter, whether you choose the annual or monthly, you can cancel anytime. So I'll see you again. Take care. God bless.